Welcome to Mountain Strong. Today my family is on its way to Fairbanks, Alaska. We stopped for the night in a place called McKinley Park, which is a small seasonal village just outside of Denali National Park. We took the opportunity to go ahead and duck into Denali National Park. We drove about as far as a private car is allowed to drive to a place called Savage River. And yes, we are at Savage River right now. It doesn't look very savage. I'm not really sure why it has earned that name. I'm going to have to look that up at some other time. But it is a beautiful place. We had the opportunity to come to Denali back in September of last year and saw the autumn colors, and it was really beautiful then. But there's a whole different kind of beauty now that we've reached the end of spring, summer's beginning, things are turning green, and it's just a wonderful place, a testament to God's creative power. Today we're going to be having a look at a psalm which declares the power of our God, Psalm 68. We looked at the first half of this back in McKinley Park. We are now going to finish it and look at the second half of the psalm. So if you missed the first half of the psalm, I encourage you to go back and look at the video just before this one. But we'll now read the second half of Psalm 68 from verse 19. Blessed be the Lord, who daily bears us up. God is our salvation. Our God is a God of salvation, and to God the Lord belong deliverances from death. But God will strike the heads of his enemies, the hairy crown of him who walks in his guilty ways. The Lord said, I will bring them back from Bashan, I will bring them back from the depths of the sea, that you may strike your feet in their blood, that the tongues of your dogs may have their portion from the foe. Your procession is seen, O God, the procession of my God, my King, into the sanctuary. The singers in front, the musicians last, between them virgins playing tambourines. Bless God in the great congregation, the Lord, O you who are of Israel's fountain. There is Benjamin, the least of them in the lead, the princes of Judah in their throng, the princes of Zebulun, the princes of Naphtali. Summon your power, O God, the power, O God, by which you have worked for us. Because of your temple at Jerusalem, kings shall bear gifts to you. Rebuke the beasts that dwell among the reeds, the herd of bulls with the calves of the peoples. Trample underfoot those who lust after tribute. Scatter the peoples who delight in war. Nobles shall come from Egypt. Cush shall hasten to stretch out her hands to God. O kingdoms of the earth, sing to God. Sing praises to the Lord. To him who rides in the heavens, the ancient heavens, behold, he sends out his voice, his mighty voice. Ascribe power to God, whose majesty is over Israel, and whose power is in the skies. Awesome is God from his sanctuary, the God of Israel. He is the one who gives power and strength to his people. Blessed be God. As we reflect upon this psalm in light of the previous study, if you remember in the previous study we talked about how the psalmist was picturing sort of this victory march of God. Now, what's interesting about the rest of this psalm is that the victory march of God doesn't eliminate the enemies of God. And so you see him ascending on high and receiving those gifts and taking them from the rebellious and kind of taking control of the situation in verse 18. But just because he's taken control of the situation does not mean that the problems are over or that the enemies are gone. As we reflect together on these verses that follow, I want you to think about that as a reality of the life of faith. Just because God wins a victory in our life does not mean that we are not going to face future battles, and it certainly doesn't mean that the enemy goes away. I think about the portrayal of Christ's temptation, particularly in Luke's account, because in Luke's account, after Satan has finished tempting Jesus, it says in Luke chapter 4 and verse 13 that the devil departs from him for a season, or as the English Standard Version says, until an opportune time. The devil is always looking for opportune times. And in other words, God's people always have enemies. They're always faced with enemies. The presence of enemies, though, doesn't change the victorious nature of our God. And I think the psalmist is showing us that even though there are these enemies who are present, it doesn't change the way the psalmist views his situation. And so God is enthroned in verse 18. But notice the reflections upon his enthronement in verses 19 and 20. In verse 19, notice how he says that God daily loads us with benefits, the New King James says, or in the English Standard Version which we're using, he daily bears us up. I don't mind either picture, really, and there really is a translation difficulty there, and it could be either. The picture of God loading me down with blessings, I like that. And I also like the picture of God bearing me upon His shoulders. And I think about whatever I might need, whether it's to be borne along by God in the battles that I face, or to be daily loaded with benefits from the victories that God has helped me to win, and from the blessings which He showers upon me because of the victorious nature of Himself. Both of those pictures are beautiful, and they help me as I think about the enemies that I might face in my future. In verse 20, a second reflection, how he sees that salvation is from God. And I love the picture of faith here, because the psalmist envisions God overcoming his greatest enemy, the enemy of death. And if the psalmist could look forward in faith to God overcoming that great enemy when he had not yet seen our resurrected Lord, how much greater faith should we have that God is going to be able to overcome all the struggles that we face, because we've seen Him defeat death in the person of Christ. As we reflect upon those two things then, the fact that God either loads us with benefits or that He bears us up daily, as we reflect upon that He is our salvation even from our greatest enemies, we can have confidence in what God will do. And that's exactly how he responds based upon those two reflections. In verse 21, he sees God as striking down his enemies. He sees God as bringing the heads of his enemies down, the crown, the hairy crown of him who walks in his guilty ways. I can't help but picture there the hairy crown as opposed to a real crown. I know it's probably simply a reflection upon the top of a person's head, but nevertheless, you think about a king wearing a real crown, and you think about the person who maybe envisions himself being a king but only has hair on top of his head, and that's the kind of person who would purport to stand against God. He's no real king. No enemy that we face has any real power. God is greater than these. And so we see God saying to the psalmist in verse 22 that He is going to bring his enemies back so that he can experience victory. And so it's not enough to send the enemies fleeing into retreat, right? He says these enemies are going to come back from Bashan, even back from the depths of the sea. And you can't help but think about Jonah there, even though I don't think the psalmist has anything like that in mind. That God will bring people back. It doesn't matter how far they've gone. He'll bring them back, and God's people will experience victory. The picture in verse 23 is a very gruesome picture, but one that's in keeping with the hyperbolic nature of the Psalms that we've seen to this point. When God's people experience victory, it is a total victory. And let's not forget that this is a time in which God's people were fighting in physical warfare, in which they'd understand and appreciate pictures like this, and that imagery would ring true to perhaps the soldier who read this, who was needing to regain his confidence in God. In verses 24 through 27, God continues this sort of victorious march. We see the people, kind of leading forth this procession, praising God. You see the least is in the front. I like that in verse 27. Remember how Jesus, when He came on the scene, He said the very same thing. He said the last shall be first, the first shall be last. And that's how it is in the procession here of God. But notice in verses 28 through 31, this is where the psalmist now is grappling with those real enemies that he's faced. But that grappling or that struggling has come after all of these statements of faithfulness based upon the position that God holds. It's a very interesting day. I'm getting rained on. It's sunny. It's just a beautiful, beautiful day. But anyway, in verses 28 through 31, he encourages God, begs God to summon His power, the power by which you have worked for us. So bring back that power that I've seen you exert in the past. Bring it to my situation now. Because of your temple at Jerusalem, he says, though, in verse 29, after making that request, he says, kings will bear gifts to you, and those enemies will be really nothing in front of you. There's some translation difficulty in verse 30, and I'll go ahead and point out that I don't know all there is to know about that. But verse 30, it talks about the beasts that dwell among the reeds. Perhaps that's imagery reflective of Egypt. Perhaps the herds of the bulls reflective of the people round about Israel in some other way. We know that bulls and such were associated with idolatrous worship. But in any event, whether he's describing people as animals for the sake of showing their kind of diminutiveness in the light of God, or whether there's some kind of purposeful imagery there, I'm not exactly sure. But notice how the enemies are defeated, placed into tribute, and God reigns over the situation. Nobles shall come from Egypt, it says in verse 31, and Cush, as far south as the psalmist could imagine, shall hasten to stretch out her hands to God. I truly appreciate, though, that when God wins victories over people, It is not merely to stomp upon them, as it is in verse 23, not merely to tread them down. Notice how these nations are defeated before God and His people. But then in verse 32, they're invited to join in the language of praise. Kingdoms of the earth sing to God, sing praises to the Lord. And there's a pause there. A pause to realize that, once again, whatever temporal enemies we might face, we're not talking necessarily about Satan in this psalm, we're talking about real physical enemies and problems. Whatever enemies we might face in this life, if they're people, we want them on the side of God. If there is any way that this can work to more people joining the chorus, the procession of victory that is our God's procession of victory, that's what we want, and that's what the psalmist wants. And so again, faith sees that God is going to be able to overcome any enemy that we face. But God is ultimately going to seek to have people on His side. He doesn't want to reign in victory over people. He wants to daily load people with blessings. And I really appreciate that about the God that we serve, that He wants to give, He does not want to take. The psalm ends with these wonderful words of praise. He calls the nations to praise, as I've said in verses 32 and 33, to sing to the one who rides in the heavens. These glorious pictures of God and His victory will really help us if we reflect on these things when we're facing struggles. But verse 34, he ascribes power to God. He lends all of the power that he possibly can to God. He knows that power resides in Him and not in himself. But then in verse 35, even though all the power is in God and not in us, when we're on God's side, we're on the side of one who is truly powerful. And so He is the one who gives power and strength to His people. God is not in the place of victory merely for Himself, as we've already said. He's there to share it with others. He wants to load us with blessings. He ascended on high, as the last video talked about. He ascended on high, led captivity captive, gave gifts to men. He wants us to experience victory. And so when you're reflecting upon this psalm in its totality, realize that victory belongs to God. It's true in the past, it's true in the present, it will be true in the future. Realize that God's victory in your past doesn't mean that you're not going to face difficulties in the future. In fact, the enemies are still there, and there is the possibility still there, if those enemies are people, for them to be won over to the side of God. Always remember that. But if it's Satan that's against you, or if it's some force in life that seems to be against you, a sickness, an illness, a terrible situation, realize that our victorious God will carry you through. He always has, and He always will. May God bless you today.